Hey everyone, and welcome to another Konoha Reviews. Today we take a look at the game Eternal Darkness for the Gamecube, that according to many, is a very underrated cult classic. I knew a few people who had played it back in the day, and swore that it was so good that it's one of those games that fans have been yearning for a new sequel. The game unfortunately did not sell well at all, and the company got in all sorts of trouble with the development of some of their future games on the next console. So the expectations were high since this game can be found on many people's list on the number 1 spot of most underrated GameCube games. As I have now finally played it, I can definitely tell that it surprised me very pleasantly on some parts and even blew me away sometimes. But there are also a few things I think are not that good, and am surprised that the game gets so much praise by those defending it without acknowledging some of its weaker parts. Let's dive in to find out more, shall we? Eternal Darkness tells the story of Alex Roivas, a young woman who recently found out that her grandfather had been the victim of a gruesome murder. Now she must search his gigantic mansion and uncover the past of what has happened. You do this by unlocking new areas in the mansion each time that will hold a page of an old cursed text, the Necronomicon. Each chapter of the game comes with a single page, and whenever you use this page, the game transports you to a new character and a new time period where you have to solve puzzles and battle enemies. There are a total of 12 characters you will play as, which was one of the main drawing points since it offers a lot of variety in terms of the characters. From an ancient Roman centurion to an Italian architect during the Renaissance or a firefighter in more modern times. With some games, even bad games, you often get that the first 15 to 20 minutes can actually be enjoyable. The setting, aesthetic, or initial gameplay can still be considered fun until it wears down and becomes apparent that it's very monotonous, repetitive, or the charm of the aesthetic has worn off. Ironically, with this game, in my opinion, the first 20 minutes or so were quite boring and bad, only to find out that the more I played, the more I was starting to like it as new mechanics were introduced. The mansion, for example. In the beginning, a big part of the mansion is accessible, but you cannot solve any of the puzzle elements yet until you have completed specific chapters. Having me run around the mansion at first was like running blindly through a maze, but as I was starting to understand what the game was expecting, I really loved coming back to the mansion and knowing, now I own this ability and I can go here and here now. It's almost a spin on the Metroidvania genre, where you need to go back to earlier areas once you have unlocked certain skills. But it wasn't just the mansion that had me in the beginning a bit bored and confused, but it was also the combat. Now the combat unfortunately is the weakest part of the game, and in fact it is so weak that I'm surprised that the people defending this game don't mention this issue. Now the amount of enjoyment I got out of the combat went a bit up and down, so let me explain. When you meet your first character, beside Alex, you find yourself in the boots of an ancient Roman centurion. He has a sword at his hand and you can get to fight undead zombies in some ruins. The combat is very still and boring, with you just pressing the A button over and over again until they go down. It actually takes a lot of hits to take down the enemies, and I was just doing the same thing over and over and over again. When you are in the next chapter though, it explains that you can hold one of the shoulder buttons and aim for specific areas like the head, torso, or arms. By attacking these specifically, you can hinder the enemy greatly. Cut off a zombie's head and it will start to flail around it wildly, often also hitting his own mates. Or cut off one of their arms and they cannot use their swiping attacks anymore. This is a really cool mechanic, and that made the combat feel fresh for quite a while, but unfortunately the combat does not stay interesting throughout the whole game. The game is quite long. It took me around 10 hours or so to complete on my first run. The types of enemies you face are only a handful. There are little critters like trappers that try to trap you in a dimension, which you then have to escape from purely as a time waster. Then there are the zombies, and then there are the bigger horrors of which you have to cut off 3 heads before they go down. Then there are also the fast bone thieves and armored summoners. But the combat feels pretty much the same with all of these, and it never evolves to something better, unlike the magic system. I talked to one of my friends who actually really liked the game, and he said he did not mind the combat at all. But soon after, he said that he used particular magic to make himself invisible to run past the enemies all the time. This exactly proves my point. The fact that you would make yourself invisible to not get into conflict with the enemies is a showcase to me that the combat mechanics are flawed. Because if you make enemies to fight with, but the players rather make themselves invisible, That is a pretty big flaw in my opinion. Anyway, that is my biggest critique of the game, and in all honesty, I wonder if the game would have been better without the combat, because otherwise it feels very much like an adventure puzzle game. Which is also why it's so surprising that it has such a strong cult following, because the subject matter and genre is very niche. Now if we go back to the first part of the Centurion, there's something really cool here. In his chapter, you get to choose which godly power to take, and therefore which Lovecraftian type of god will be your main enemy throughout the game. If you choose red, all of the enemies will look slightly different than the other two versions, and they will do more damage to your health. If you choose the blue power, they will do more damage to your magic, and the green one will do more damage to your sanity. It will also alter cutscenes slightly, and in all honesty, it's very cool that the creators went their way into making these alternative playthroughs possible, depending on your choice. Red is definitely the more difficult version, and I did not know this at the beginning, and as I chose that one, I had apparently a more difficult time than where I had to choose green. So this is a very good effort, and the subject matter itself is also really cool, but again, quite niche. I can honestly say that this game, Eternal Darkness, is without a doubt the most Lovecraftian game that I've ever played. More so than Call of Cthulhu, both the old and new one, and more so than The Sinking City, and more also than Bloodborne. But the approach is quite different. The Centurion you are in the first chapter turns out to be the bad guy, as he serves the ancient god for millennia to follow in order to summon him to Earth. This means you see guardians and the ancient beings in the flesh rather than the usual approach of having a cult give hints about its whereabouts like in Call of Cthulhu. Personally, I do really love the whole cult approach and being a detective to unravel the cult's secrets. There are also chapters where a cult plays a part, like the one where you play as a monk in the 15th century, but there's no secret to what they are worshipping. The fact that it creates its own Lovecraftian gods and setting is very cool indeed, and the magic that you get to use taps in this perfectly. Throughout the game, you unlock several magic spells that you can use to heal, to fight enemies, or to solve puzzles. They start out simple, with for example the ability to enhance an item to have it perform more damage. What's more is that you can align it with one of the three gods, or four if you are able to find a fourth, which plays into the rock, paper, scissors mechanic. Namely that red is more powerful than green, green is more powerful than blue, and blue is more powerful than red. Since I chose red, it meant that most of my enemies were aligned with the red god, and therefore, enhancing my weapons with blue magic got me better results. You are encouraged to experiment by aligning sigils and signs, which even means that you can create new spells before you get them chronologically in the game. By mixing and matching signs, I was able to achieve the shield spell, which shielded me from enemy attacks, way before the game gave it to me via a scripted event. Whenever you perform the magic, you hear an awesome sounding demonic voice spell out all the signs you use to perform the spell. For the first few spells, you only need 3 signs, but later on, you can upgrade all spells to level 5 and level 7. This means that the words that are spoken by the demonic voice also take longer, and that comes with a price. For if you are attacked before the speaking of the spell is done, the magic will be cancelled. Therefore, it comes with an extra strategic element where you might not want to use some of the best magic since it takes so long to perform. I'm talking about close to 10 seconds, which in the heat of battle can be a death sentence. And then there are of course the highlights of the sanity effects that the game throws at you and really is what made this game famous. Since you have a sanity meter, this can go up and down, and the less sanity you have, the more frequent weird things will happen. They can be very subtle, like suddenly the image changing to black and white or suddenly having the audio muted. Some of these have not aged well since they make use of the imagery that was very common with VCR screens. But there are a few that still stand out and had me really surprised. At one time, I got the blue screen of death and thought my game had crashed. The other time my character killed himself during a reload animation, or the game pretends it's starting over by showing the pre-title screen again. Most of these effects are very fun and indeed unique, and it makes you wonder what other kind of weird effects are in the game. Eternal Darkness doesn't really have a lot of scares, except one that apparently is quite notorious involving a bathtub, and it certainly got me jumping when I experienced it. What's cool too is that you will be revisiting a lot of the same areas but in different time frames, adding familiarity and yet the new and unknown. A cathedral where you track down a cult as a monk later gets used as a field hospital during World War I. Knowing that you were here, and the horrors that took place here, adds to the weight of the situation. It's also cool that in some campaigns, characters will overlap and you will meet the spirits of characters you played as earlier. I personally did wish though that the environments were a bit more varied, because most are just dark and dusty catacombs and ruins. Despite taking place in different parts of the world, a lot of the environments felt a bit repetitive and similar. Honestly, the most fun and unique environment is the mansion, and thus my favorite parts in the game were the Maximilian Roivas and Alex's grandfather sequences. The game overall still holds up in my opinion, but it is not the incredible experience that some fans loom about. The appeal is the setting and the characters, and of course the quirky sanity effects. But some of the repetitive environments and definitely the combat keeps it from remaining a gold status throughout these years. Nevertheless, it is still a game worth checking out, and in the end, Eternal Darkness gets an 8. I would also like to see a sequel to this, but maybe not such a focus on combat, but more on storytelling and puzzles. Or at least make the combat as deep as the magic, and then we surely will finally have a gold status Lovecraft game.